What's going on, everybody? Happy Wednesday. It's me back at the helm. Shad's still in Michigan, and I hope everybody's doing fine after that kick in the nuts yesterday on the market side. Going to be doing things a little bit different today, and we're basically going to do a fireside chat with Hirsh Jain, the founder of Ananda Strategy. There wasn't really a lot of headlines today. The tape is a little bit muted. So we're going to basically talk everything cannabis, everything from California to Ohio, capital markets, hemp, rescheduling. Feel free to fire off any questions within the chat, and we can definitely get to those later in the conversation. But let's pop Hirsh up here, Arns, and get the party started. How's it going, sir?
Hey, Anthony. Great to be here.
Good. Good to see you. I know we got to meet back at Benzinga, Miami, I think last year.
Yep.
And then go back and forth on Twitter. It's always good to get you new faces on the show. So good to have you. So I mean, before we jump into it, I know we got a lot to cover. Let's just walk us through like what's your how long you've been in the space, what brought you to this crazy world that we all decided to live in the cannabis space, and what are you up to currently?
Totally. And again, thanks so much for having me, Anthony. I've worked in the cannabis space for 7 years now. It kind of feels like longer, although, I've been doing work in cannabis for most of my life. So, I grew up in California where cannabis was a really big part of the culture. When I was in college, I started, doing work in cannabis. I worked at the UC Berkeley Public Defender's Office as the cannabis lead, basically defending students that were accused of cannabis violations by their university, which back then could get you kicked out of school or you could lose your financial aid. So that's kind of how I come to this. I also went to law school after that and focused on the history of the war on drugs. And so intellectually, this is a concept I'm interested in. And then, prior to working in cannabis, starting about 7 years ago, I did a few different things. I was a strategy consultant at McKinsey for a number of years. And then probably the coolest job I ever had before cannabis is that I helped build out the policy team at Airbnb and negotiated every major policy agreement that they had around the world for a few years. So got to pass those laws in the US and got to live in Japan and pass those laws there. And I mentioned that because, I thought that was the perfect analog for cannabis. I had this hypothesis that the same skill set, right, building a legal and regulatory environment around this, product for which this was demand and mitigating the externalities for people who didn't want to participate would be applicable to cannabis. So long story short, that turned out to be the case. As a Californian, after Prop 64 passed in 2016, I knew I had to, spend my life doing this. And it's been the best sort of professional experience I've had. Obviously, there's a lot of ups and downs. And just, quickly, what I do is help brands and retailers make sense of a very complicated regulatory environment and open up new stores, enter new states, and make sense of how they can build their business in what we know is a very complicated regulatory scheme. So there's more I could say, but that's me.
So it's awesome. Great to definitely have you. So I had a whole kind of rubric for the conversation in my head, but you kind of just said something that sparked my interest. War on drugs. So you actually studied the history of the war on drugs, I'm assuming in its entirety up to, let's say, modern day.
Totally. Yeah. I mean,
how did we get here?
Yeah.
How did we get here, and how are drugs winning the war on drugs?
Drugs have won. I mean, first I should say when I was in law school, this was 15 years ago, it was really unusual to craft a curriculum around the war on drugs. People thought I was crazy. I was lucky enough to study under what I consider two of the greatest race and criminal justice scholars of the past half century. So, and both of them actually recently passed away. So Charles Ogletree, longtime race and criminal justice scholar, famously a mentor to Barack and Michelle Obama. And then Lonnie Guinair, who worked for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in the 1980s. So I had a couple of great mentors that really introduced me to this subject matter, one I'd been interested in my entire life. And, what I'm about to say is something that most of your audience already knows, right? That for long periods of American history, cannabis was not criminalized. Early in the 20th century, as a function of the Mexican-American Revolution and immigration from Mexico, cannabis was demonized. And then again, as we all know, in the mid-1930s, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed by Harry Anslinger, who was basically someone who, wanted to develop an excuse for developing, right, a big agency to sort of eradicate the cannabis plant and had a lot of racial motivations for it. So that's how the war on drugs started. And then again, as most people know, Richard Nixon kind of assumed office after the civil rights movement, employed a Southern strategy to get to the White House. And we're all famous with, all familiar, I should say, with the John Ehrlichman quote that said, hey, cannabis offered us the opportunity to demonize the anti-war left and communities of color at the same time. And then, again, I'm telling you things you already know, but obviously Nixon kind of started it. Reagan really ramped it up with the militarization of the police department. And then if we're being fair, other people who had a hand in the war on drugs were Bill Clinton and, our current president, Joe Biden. So this was a bipartisan affair. And then the last thing I'll say, and this is, I think, why this conversation is so exciting, is that obviously we saw a turn in 1996 when California was the first state to legalize medical cannabis. As a Californian, that's something I'm, really proud of. And I think the conversation we're going to have today is, okay, so over the course of the next 30 years, right, what was the movement that California set off first medically, then adult use? And it's a great example of the future happening in California first.
So and I agree with you completely. I mean, I really do believe in my heart of hearts that the war on drugs, especially as it relates to cannabis, was racially motivated throughout several levels of government. And I mean, it's still perpetuated today with everything from the DEA to the prison industrial complex. I mean, we could have probably a whole show on that. Talking about, I'll bring up rescheduling, I guess, already, with the Clintons and with President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, who's presently running for the presidency. Is this their way of rectifying the situation? Do you think by starting with rescheduling and then eventually leading into ultimately descheduling and legalizing cannabis, because not only the people are behind it now, but it is a way to actually right the wrongs of the past that is actually pretty ingrained in American culture right now?
Totally. I mean, I basically agree with everything you just said, right? Like, you highlighted a bunch of figures that were not good leaders on cannabis early, like neither Clinton nor Kamala Harris, no Joe Biden. None of them were cannabis advocates initially. So they have a lot of, they did a lot of negative things when it comes to the war on drugs. But you're right. Yeah. There has been a dramatic shift in public opinion over the course of the last several decades. And that has been a function of the fact that we have set up these state markets in different states and things haven't turned to anarchy and people find this to be a beneficial plant, right? So the presence of this as a commercial good has really destigmatized cannabis. So there's been a big shift in public opinion. And then all of the currents you were just speaking about, Anthony, right? In those ensuing decades, our prisons continued to fill up. And so we said it doesn't make sense to criminalize people for a plant. In those ensuing decades, all sorts of addictions to pharmaceutical drugs and opioids developed, which made cannabis seem like a reasonable alternative. And so I think all of those currents are motivating their behavior, just like they do for any politicians. And look, I mean, all progress in American politics is incremental. Every great social movement has incremental steps, right? If we're talking about the civil rights movement, it's Brown versus Board of Education, and then the Civil Rights Act, and then the Voting Rights Act. And so rescheduling is another step in that trajectory. And look, obviously we could spend this whole conversation talking about rescheduling, but maybe a couple things I'll say, just tying it back to California. Even though I'm really disappointed in California's market, right? Rescheduling is codifying the principle that California put forth in '96, that cannabis has medical utility. And so that's really exciting. And I think it sends a profound signal, not only in the country, but throughout the world, that the leading public health authority in the Western world recognizes that cannabis has medical utility. So, we're going to be busy for the rest of the decade getting this where it needs to get to, but there's no way of denying that this is an incredible and step forward in America.
Does it surprise you? Does it surprise you that the U.S. is where it is? Meanwhile, Germany's where they are, Canada's where they are. I mean, they're probably pretty much the only G7 nations that have adult use legalized, I guess, on a federal level. Did you think by now we would be further along in the process, or knowing what you know about the government from a historical perspective, this is kind of par for the course, the pace that we're actually moving?
I'm not really surprised, but I mean, your point is well taken. I'd say a few things. I'd say a lot of the progress that we're seeing in Western Europe is actually a function of the progress that we're seeing in the United States. I do not think Germany would be moving on cannabis today if they had not observed the United States over the course of a decade expand cannabis access. And so that's just a way of stating what we've always known. The United States sets the agenda when it comes to global drug policy. I mean, I'll say my family is from India. I come from centuries of people that have used cannabis for medical purposes, but that stopped with my parents' generation because they grew up under the thumb of the war on drugs, right? Even all the way in India. And so now we have the opportunity to turn that ship around and to lead in the right direction instead of the wrong direction. So I think the United States deserves some credit for course correction. And then, on what you alluded to regarding Germany, obviously Germany, moved in a much more unified way. I think in
Yeah.
the US, as a function of our federalist system, like we give a lot of power to states. And so on many issues, whether it's gay marriage or whether it's on sports gambling, right, or whether it's on cannabis, we do see an incremental movement and these ideas kind of spread across the country. And so I think it's also just part of the governing structure that we have in this country that California takes a step and then, Washington takes
Yeah.
a step and then over a couple of decades, we all get there together.
Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely ultimately get there. I mean, I'd like to think that the momentum is the momentum is the greatest it's ever been in the history of this industry right now. I mean, we have a potential Democratic ticket. Top of the ticket is for legalizing cannabis. Said the DEA needs to act quicker. The VP comes from Minnesota, adult use market. The writing's on the wall. We just need to have action. But I mean, tying it back into California, I mean, California is a market that we talk about a lot. It's also a market that we talk about has a lot of turmoil and strife coming out of it from an operator's perspective. What, in your opinion, went wrong in California or is going wrong currently? And how does it get out of the cycle that it's in? Someone has to be winning there and people have to be making money there. It's my opinion that if you're a brand in the United States from a cannabis perspective, it's probably to your best advantage to be winning and have a presence in that market. Maybe you don't agree with that, but I'd love to hear your feedback on it.
No, I mean, I agree with what you said at the end there, which is to say, like, brands that have experience operating in the very competitive California market, I think are well positioned to succeed in other states. And, I have some clients, I mean, just shameless plugs, clients like Mammoth Distribution that has made the Heavy Hitters product, or Level Pro Tabs that have, operated in the knife fight that is in California and then have moved on
Yeah.
to other states. So I certainly believe, what you can say positively about the California market is it has the most discerning consumers. It has the most interesting, brands that are out there. It is really where you sharpen the knife. So all of that is true. But with that being said, as someone who loves California, who has lived in the state for most of my life, my most profound disappointment about the cannabis industry has been what has happened in California. And while I am enormously optimistic about what is happening across most of the rest of the country, I am not optimistic about California in the short term. With that said, there are some folks who can still make money there, but I'm just saying that as an overall market. And to diagnose the problem, I'm not going to say anything too profound here. I'm going to say the things you already know. Why is California's market so challenged? Well, one, to be fair, obviously it had the hardest problem that was out there. It had the most entrenched illicit market. So it had a more difficult task than anyone else, right? Anyone who's lived in California knows it's a very sophisticated market. But the reason it's aired is two reasons primarily, and that's tax rates and retail access. It's very simple, right? California all in has one of the highest tax burdens in the country. That doesn't come as a surprise to anyone. There's a 15% state excise tax. There's no cap on local taxes. So local taxes can be 10%. Just to underscore that, in most other blue states, they cap taxes at 3%. In California, it's 10, right?
Okay.
Medical purchases are not exempt from the tax in California. The way they calculate taxes is essentially a form of compounding where, the taxes are inclusive of the other taxes that have been imposed earlier in the supply chain. So
Yeah.
the obvious point there is it's at least 50%, sometimes twice as expensive to purchase cannabis legally, that versus Michigan, which is about 16%. And then
Yeah.
the other issue in California is just the lack of retail access. Again, I think anyone in the cannabis space knows this by now. There's about 1,200 dispensaries in California. You need 4,000. As someone who drives around this state often, I can drive several hours without passing a legal dispensary and pass 50 illegal ones along the way. And so
Yeah.
those are all the reasons California's market is, on a per capita basis, the lowest, mature adult use market, and is about a third, right, of the per capita sales of Michigan. So,
And then one thing, I know you've been very vocal about Ohio. Seems like you've been very excited about Ohio, focused on Ohio. I think it's warranted, and all of us are focused on Ohio because I think it's going to bring the growth narrative back to MSOs come, let's say, Q3, Q4 into earnings season. What's going on in Ohio right now? How's sales, in your view, kicked off? Like, what are some, I guess, interesting data points from the market, and how do you really see that market evolving? Because I know you did have some pretty bullish overall TAM targets well before we saw adult use launch.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, look, I think Ohio is a defining moment in the history of the cannabis industry, and that's why I think this conversation is so timely. And I'll kind of explain why. I think there were a few sort of components to that, right? First is, hey, how have adult use sales launched, right? And what do we expect in the market? And then there's, I think, the secondary questions of what impact does Ohio have on its very conservative neighbors, and what impact does Ohio have on the country, given the unique place that it occupies in the Republican national consciousness. So I'll start with that first one. Like, okay, adult use sales have started in Ohio. Like, where are we at? So we all know that we've done about $20 million a week, right, in the first 2 weeks, or about 2 weeks into adult use sales. A little bit more than that, right? So we're at a $1.1 billion run rate. So that's where we are now. I mean, just for some context, New York, which is a state that is almost twice the size of Ohio and legalized cannabis back in March of 2021, right? It's almost 3.5 years ago. Ohio has already lapped New York in its first 2 weeks of an adult use market. So it's not at Michigan quite yet, but it's made significant progress. So we're at a $1.1 billion run rate. To lay out my sort of bullish projections on how it'll perform, I think in a month or so, we'll see something closer to a $30 million week or a $1.5 billion run rate. Now, the reason I say that, Anthony, is first, there's about 20 stores in Ohio that actually haven't opened for adult use yet, that are still navigating, right, the provisional licensing process. So we got about 115, 117 open as of today, but we're going to see about 20 more stores open a month from now. And then the second thing is, on September 7th, a lot of these limits expire, limits on advertising. The fact that you can't buy eighths in Ohio, you can only buy them in 1/10. And I guarantee you there are people buying 2 1/10 instead of the 2 eighths.
You could only buy 1/10?
1/10. It's a very odd. These are the medical rules that are in place until September 7th. So, you can't buy pre-rolls until September 7th. You can only buy 1/10, not eighths. And my bet is that there's people buying 2 1/10 instead of 2 eighths, for example, right? So you can't do that. High concentrate products are not allowed. And there's also no advertising. And I point that out, like, if I could use an analogy, right? Why do the Missouri and the Maryland markets perform slightly differently? Like, Missouri is about a $1.5 billion market, and Maryland is about a 1.1, 1.2. And you're like, why is that? They're about the same population, 6 million people.
Yeah.
They both have low tax rates. They both have, a lot of adept, especially in Maryland, adept MSOs there. They both border neighboring states. But in Maryland, they have really crummy advertising rules, and they have significant product restrictions. And so that explains, I think, the 20, 30% delta. The reason Maryland is like 90, 95 million a month, and Missouri is like 120. So that's why I think we'll start to see an uptick, in this fall, as you can start to do advertising and those product limits expire. And then just concluding here on the ultimate market potential, I think over the course of the next 18 months, you're going to see a slow but like linear increase to a $3 billion market. And, the reason I say that, Anthony, is next year, you're going to have 170 more stores opening, right? So 3 new stores a week are going to open in Ohio. We're going to go from 110, 120 to close to 300. So that's going to be really significant. And right now, it's great that Ohio is open, but the prices are astronomical, which is a function. It's insane, right? I wouldn't probably buy cannabis legally in Ohio just yet, right? I would go to Michigan. But I think 6 months from now, that'll change, because gas is expensive too, right? And so, like, if you can shrink the delta between those price points, which will happen, I think you'll be able to recapture a lot of that demand that is going to other states.
I was just going to ask you that actually as a follow-up question, because I did see the article from Headset that we actually both posted, but I read it. It was a great article, but the pricing was it was the highest pricing out of all the cohort of the states in the data set. So do you see price compression coming online eventually? I mean, it's going to have to kind of, I don't want to say revert to the mean as adult use just kicked off, but I mean, we are going to see price compression, but I'm sure when those stores open and we start to then see more higher volumes, it'll kind of equal out, and you'll still be able to get that linear growth in the market.
Yeah, I would say I think prices will normalize over time. I don't think prices will ever get to the place where they are in Michigan, which, as we all know, is extremely low. And I
Yeah.
think that's a function. Michigan has a super open licensing system. And we should remember the Michigan market took shape really during COVID when things were
Mhm.
gangbusters and everybody was trying to like, up supply as much as possible. So I don't think Ohio pricing will ever fully compete with Michigan, but I do think 6 months from now, 9 months from now, you'll reach a point where someone who was previously driving an hour and a half to Michigan will say to themselves, that doesn't really make sense anymore. I should go to the store that's 10 minutes away because
Yeah.
3 hours and $30 on gas may not make it worth it.
Yeah, I mean, your marginal cost, unless you're just going and buying huge amounts to, let's just say, redistribute. I'll say to be kind, it doesn't make sense to be making that trek to go all the way into Michigan. That we'll call it the Sun Belt. Do you see that as being a growth driver for the industry as a whole on a go forward basis? Let's call it Ohio, Missouri, Oklahoma, and then eventually getting down into Texas. And from a branding perspective, are you seeing the brands from California and let's say from the East Coast start to find their places within those markets, or are you seeing homegrown brands predominantly sold there that are coming out of, let's say, the Sun Belt operators?
Totally. Yeah, I see this happening, right? The next stages of the cannabis industry happening in a couple phases. I think actually the first phase is the Midwest. I think over the course
Okay.
of the next year, the Midwest will be recognized as the power center of the country. And then to your point, I think we'll really start to see it in the Sun Belt. And so just to hit on the Midwest, there's Michigan, which is the monster, the highest per capita sales in the country, probably 3.5 billion this year. Illinois is already at 2 billion. We were just discussing Ohio and its $3 billion market potential. Missouri, which is also part of the Midwest, is $1.5 billion. Minnesota, which will come online, 6 to 9 months from now, is a $1.5–2 billion market. So those 5 states, that's like $11–12 billion in sales right now,
Yeah.
which is insane, right? With almost 3 times, or what California is, or you could put California and New York and New Jersey together, right? And it would still exceed that. So that's remarkable.
Yeah.
And then to your point, I think the Sun Belt is up next, and I think the triggering event there is Florida, and obviously Florida, is the South, right? But I think the same impact that Ohio is having on its neighbors, right? The impact it's having on West Virginia, on Indiana, and Kentucky. I think Florida opens up, the Deep South, particularly Georgia, and even in
Yeah.
places like South Carolina, it's a 3-hour drive to Tallahassee from some parts of South Carolina, and so
Yeah.
there's ongoing efforts in South Carolina and North Carolina to legalize medical programs. And I see, similar to Indiana or Wisconsin, where they've tried to pass a medical program and they've failed. Now we have this big triggering event of my neighbor allowing adult use sales. And that is really going to increase the pace of change.
Yeah, we actually have Nancy Mason next Monday, if I'm not mistaken. So I mean, we're definitely going to get an update from her on the medical market in South Carolina, and hopefully the legislation is coming down the pipe. Are you looking at Texas at all? I mean, I saw a stat earlier this week. There's 7,000 hemp dispensaries potentially in the state. I mean, I would have to say that is more that is a worse I don't even want to call it a pandemic. That's a worse plague than what we're seeing in New York with illegal cannabis shops. I mean, is this hemp genie out of the bottle? And really, are we at the point where the toothpaste really can't get put back in? 7,000, if it's correct, seems crazy as far as density goes for that state.
Totally. I mean, Texas, right? What Texas kind of epitomizes the ludicrousness of the way we've set up the cannabis framework in this country. So
Yeah.
maybe perhaps the first question is, why does Texas continue to ban cannabis? I think one thing that's important for people to know is that the lieutenant governor position in Texas is super powerful, right? So in California, lieutenant governor has no power. When Gavin Newsom was the lieutenant governor of California for 8 years under Jerry Brown, we didn't even hear from him ever. In Texas,
Okay.
It's just the opposite. The lieutenant governor is the head of the Senate and has a ton of power. And the guy who's the current lieutenant governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, hates cannabis more than anyone I've really ever seen in public life. And there aren't really term limits, right, for that. So Dan Patrick may be in office for a long time. So that is the explanation for why we've seen no progress in Texas, is that Texas has a unique quirk where they give this one dude the ability to bring bills to the floor, and he has squashed it each time. So there's that. As you pointed out, the insanity of all this is we've seen a huge proliferation of these hemp intoxicant businesses in Texas. It's the best example of how prohibition doesn't work. You say you don't want weed, but what you're doing is de facto inviting these other businesses in. As you may know, this guy, Dan Patrick, is trying to put the kibosh, right, on all this. But I don't know how you enforce against 7,000 hemp
No.
dispensaries. And again, I have concerns with some of these products, which are not fully tested and you don't know what's in them. But I don't know how you argue against a veteran in Texas who says, you didn't make weed legal. I don't want to take pharmaceuticals. The only thing I'm legally able to buy, right, is these hemp intoxicant products. Those are the kind of stories that you will see, right, if there's an
Yeah.
effort to restrict things there. So that's a concern. And then, maybe the other thing I'll just note is the collective sales of the Texas medical program are around 20 million. There are individual hemp companies in Texas that are doing 100, 150, like Hometown Hero does 150 million plus in revenue each year in Texas, which is 8 times the amount of the three marijuana operators combined. And so I always, again, not having a dog directly in this fight, when I see
Yeah.
people saying big bad marijuana is trying to monopolize this market, I think to myself, these guys are a fraction of the revenue that you guys are generating. So that seems like a misnomer.
150 million for a hemp company.
Hometown Hero.
That is
Insane.
insane. I mean, do you think, or have you talked to anybody in any forms of government, or what do you think eventually happens to hemp? Like where do you think we're sitting a year from now? Because hemp really is the predator that's stalking us. And it's out in the open. It's not going anywhere. No one seems to want to enforce against it. It's just kind of like that problem that we all know is here, but no one really has an answer to how we're going to solve this problem.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a complicated topic that I'll throw out a few observations, but I think it's really a complicated one. The first thing I will say is your question was like, hey, where are we a year from now? I think a year from now there have not been significant changes to the Farm Bill. I think regardless of what you
Yes.
yeah. Yeah, right. So we'll be living in the status quo. And, as you and I were discussing before we came on, right? Whether you agree, no matter what side of this debate that you're on, the deliberate strategy of the intoxicating hemp industry is to delay things as much as possible, because the more consumers, right, that they can get consuming these products, the more businesses that are reliant on this product, right, the more political support that they have going forward. And so it is a deliberate strategy to delay. And I think the longer we delay, the more difficult it will be to uproot. So I think that is one thing. The second thing, to state the obvious, I think all of us, who are approaching this debate have to have public health as our primary priority, right? Regardless of where we fall here, the thing all of us have to care the most about is ensuring, that people are kept safe and healthy, right? And so that is the obvious concern with a lot of these products. So I think that has to be top of mind. And again, I think there's so much to say here. Maybe one other observation I'll throw out is the one thing that the hemp industry has taught us is that restrictive sales channels are never going to be enough for cannabis to reach its full potential. I don't know why this wasn't obvious to us before, but it shows us that people do not want to walk into a dispensary a lot of the times. And so if we want cannabinoids to reach their full potential, we have to make them available in more wide distribution channels. And then we have to make them available in form factors that people are familiar with, which is why beverages have taken off. So
what do you think of beverage?
I mean, beverage is fascinating again, right? Like this is one of those things where I can't believe I didn't see it 2 years from now, right? As a long avid cannabis consumer, I always dismissed beverages because I was like, who wants to consume a beverage, right? I want to smoke. But it's like, well, not everyone is you, right? Which is sort of the obvious thing we should have realized. And so, again, to state the obvious, what you've probably heard a million times before is that the explosion in the beverage category is really a dramatic eye opener. It's a form factor that is very familiar to people, situated in channels that are familiar to people. And, it's when I go into a Total Wine, right? I think the presence of those beverages in a Total Wine, and I hope they're properly regulated, probably induce consumers to make better decisions than buying like as much vodka. The public health justification for these beverages are high. And I'll say, like, when I went to Minnesota and I could go to like a bar, right, or a pizza restaurant, and I could hang out with people and have a hemp beverage rather than having a beer. I mean, that was a profound experience. And I know that would allow me to make healthier choices. So, yeah.
I mean, we had them. I had them in the Panthers arena for the Stanley Cup. They were selling THC hemp beverages in the Panthers arena for the Stanley Cup. I can go to Total Wine around the corner from my house right now. They've probably got 20 SKUs in there with hemp beverages. I mean, I think that form factor is going to be potentially the biggest form factor for THC, just because and a lot of people disagree with me on this, but if you're going to get a THC product at a Dolphins game, if you're going to get a THC product at a music festival, chances are it's going to be a beverage. The beverage is going to be the easiest and it's going to be the most convenient, and everybody drinks. I mean, and also there's a to pair with the cannabis macro trend, you also have a serious attrition in people wanting to consume alcohol that are in the Gen Z and millennial camp. It's just not there anymore. So I mean, that's why I've been bullish on beverages for a while now, saying they're going to come out of the dispensary one point or another. We're going to see that inflection point. And you talked about stalling with hemp. Do you think that that's what's going on in Florida? Why the hemp lobby and the hemp companies have decided to align with DeSantis to hopefully stall on adult use and be able to sit here and just keep planting their flags in the Florida market?
Yeah, I mean, what I will say is the hemp lobby has aligned with DeSantis because they view legal cannabis or legal marijuana as a competitive threat, right? Just to state the obvious,
Yeah.
they view it as a threat. And I think it's really as simple as that. That has been their thinking. As many people have said before, DeSantis may be your ally this year, but just wait till the next legislative session. Like I read, for example, the veto message that he wrote when he said he was vetoing the bill. And there were strong indications that he would be open to, a somewhat restrictive bill next year. So I think this is just him trying to galvanize some potential allies for him as he tries to stay relevant, right? He just got his butt kicked in the presidential primary. He's a lame duck governor. He's just looking for a fight, right? I mean, whether you like him or not, that's how he rose to prominence, is fighting the left, right? And so that's what he sees this as. And just one other comment I want to make, there may be, there's a number of hemp businesses in Florida. And I know there are some hurt feelings between hemp and marijuana operators. I think it is a profound mistake for anyone on the hemp intoxicant side to be against Amendment 3. I mean, just to state a few things, right? The Florida GOP, it's supermajority. They're never going to legalize marijuana, right? Not anytime soon. They're trying to change the ballot initiative process such that you won't be able to do it at some point in the future. Florida has the most regressive, racially motivated arrests, perhaps of any state in the country. And so if you are a business, and you may not like the structure that was set up for marijuana, if you are a business that couches your narrative in public health and social justice, there's no defensible argument for being against Amendment 3 in Florida, because in practice, it will lead to more arrests and will delay the date by which ordinary citizens can access plant medicine. And I don't think there's any ambiguity on that question.
No, not at all. And I mean, the counterpoints right now are that people are going to be smoking weed everywhere. It's going to just be Joe Gruder's ex-chair of the Republican Party of Florida. We have sidecar legislation to pass with 3 that would ban public consumption. I mean, it's all of the talking points that they keep saying. It's going to be a monopoly. There are licenses at the Department of Health in Florida that they're going to incrementally grant. Not along with Amendment 3, but that license process is going to expand. Granted, I give anybody that wants to come and try and compete in Florida the best of luck, because it's going to cost you $80 to $100 million to come down here, super vertically integrate, and then launch it and actually be able to sell. So, I mean, coming into the Florida market and competing is going to be quite difficult. And I couldn't agree with you more. I've said this to a lot of people. DeSantis is going to align with the hemp lobby up until the election, and Q1 of 2025, you're going to see something that looks like the Miller Amendment, or you're going to see something that looks like the banning of hemp intoxicants in the state of Florida, and he's going to come out and crush the industry after he's already had his way with them. It's totally what he does. I can see it easily happening. I hope it doesn't happen, because I don't hate the hemp companies. I mean, I think they have a place within the market. We need to get along with each other. Neither of us are going anywhere. What needs to stop, though, and you probably do agree with this, is the synthetics, the Delta 8s, the Delta 10s, the THC zeros, these vapes that are being sold in gas stations that are a public safety issue, because they can get in a minor's hand. And if something happens to a minor, the story and the headline is going to read minor exposed to adult use cannabis. It's not going to say minor exposed to intoxicating hemp products. There's going to be no point of differentiation, and the collateral damage is going to fall on us. That's really the worst part that I can see. But I mean, I really do hope that 3 does get passed in Florida come November, because we do need it. I would argue that Amendment 3 might be more important than rescheduling as a whole. And then, I mean, going back to rescheduling, I know what some of what you do is capital market consulting. What do you see happening on the backs of rescheduling and this 280E essentially creating greater free cash flow for the MSOs? Do you see some sort of like consolidation or like M&A super cycle starting to hit the industry, and you start to just see assets getting gobbled up and just some of the parts plays all over the market, or do you see it continue to stay fragmented like it currently is?
Totally. And I'll share my thoughts there. And then I just want to quickly go back because I really agree with a couple of things you said on Florida. I just want to underscore it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, in terms of rescheduling, again, I'm going to say things that you've probably heard before, but this is what I really think, right? I'm really optimistic about the way that this process has unfolded. We're a month out from the comment period. I believe that, you had Adam Goers on, recently, my good friend who I've known for, almost a decade, really sharp guy. So I think the burden for an ALJ hearing is high, right? I think the likelihood of an injunction is low. So I'm optimistic about the way that process might unfold before the election. I'm optimistic that the elimination of 280E will change the financial profile of these companies and galvanize investor interest in the space. I believe the symbolic value of rescheduling will be immense. And I think it'll dovetail with a lot of these catalysts that we're seeing on the state level that I think are so exciting. Ohio and Florida being the most prominent ones. I think it'll dovetail with us getting to a majority of adult use states. And so, yeah, I think it'll renew investor interest in the space. It'll spur a wave of consolidation in the space, although that'll kind of vary by state because some states have more significant restrictions on how that is possible. And I think, to quote, our friend or my friend Scott Grossman, right? You may see a bifurcation, right? In the operators, right? There's some operators that may get stronger as a result of, this changing profile, and some for whom this may not kind of be enough to get them over the hump. So that's what I see happening. And just to go back to Florida real quick, because I agree with what you said, and I want to underscore it. You were talking about, hey, if a minor, right, is damaged by one of these products. The way I think about this is, some people are like, hey, don't restrict hemp. We're trying to liberate the plant. You're a prohibitionist. But it's like, no, that's exactly what we're doing. We're trying to shift the Overton window here. We're trying to build comfort with plant medicine. We're trying to convince the majority of people in this country who do not consume cannabis that the presence of legal cannabis will not affect them and their kids. And so, it's easy to adopt that maximalist position, but really we are trying to, like any social change, build comfort with other people who don't agree with us that this is an acceptable kind of part of life. So, yeah, just wanted to underscore that. And then the other thing I wanted to say is you mentioned DeSantis and the public smoking. That's why I'm so obsessed with Ohio. Ohio occupies a unique place in the American Republican consciousness. No Republican has ever won the White House without Ohio. DeSantis goes on rants about San Francisco and LA, but you can't do that about Cleveland. You can't do that about Columbus. You can't do that about Akron. You can't do that about Cincinnati or St. Louis, right? And so that's why I believe these red states have a way of disarming these bad faith attacks that are obviously illogical. And you can't fight these folks on logic because they're not making logical arguments. You just have to show them their cultural politics are outdated, right? So.
And then speaking of Ohio, I mean, going back to it, I mean, we had JD Vance come out and say that he didn't want fentanyl in people's marijuana bags. Being boots on the ground and having, I don't want to say an emphasis, but you're ingrained in Ohio right now. Are there any sort of attempts to educate Mr. Vance on the greater benefits of the cannabis industry, on the safety that comes with an adult use cannabis industry, and just general talking points as to how to address the industry? Because the whole scare tactic of like fentanyl is going to be in the marijuana bag, to be quite frank, I mean, it's getting old and it's just not true in the grand scheme of things. And I mean, I would think that somebody coming from that state, which, as you say, holds great brevity within the Republican Party, would be more well-versed on this topic, especially as they just had a brand new adult use come online.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I was pretty shocked, right? I never expected JD Vance to be a big fan of cannabis. But when I saw the interview that you guys did with him on Capitol Hill, when he was talking about fentanyl and some of his recent comments, that really surprised me. And so, your question was like, can he be educated? I mean, that to me displays kind of like a willful ignorance of the facts to say that safe banking is going to allow fentanyl. And he's so wrapped up in his VP thing. I don't know if we'll have much of a time to educate him, and we'll see whether he comes back to Ohio or is in DC. I will just say again, I think the most profound education is just normalization, is direct experience. And that's why I'm so obsessed with watching these news stories from Ohio. We're on the local news, which is what a lot of these folks watch in Ohio. They talk about the immense job creation, the sophistication, right, of the workers, the state of the art manufacturing facility, the tax revenue that's generated. I think that is the education, right? Maybe a different way of putting this is, how did Steve Daines, who didn't like cannabis 4 years ago in Montana, get educated on cannabis? Well, it's because Montana has the highest per capita sales of any state in this country, even though it's a small state. And I went to Montana a few months ago. I don't think it's gone to hell, as a result of that. So that's
no, no, it's a bunch of. I mean, I've been to Montana a couple times. I mean, it's very red, and I mean, it's. I met actually with Steve Daines when we were in Washington. He had great things to say. I mean, he's a champion for the industry, and he's a great friend of the industry. It was awesome to be able to meet him. I guess on a closing note, I mean, this might be controversial. We have potentially RFK dropping out on Friday. He said he's going to have an event. Donald's in Arizona. Do you actually think that at any point in time Trump does address cannabis as he said at that press conference, or were those just talking points caught up in the moment? And what he alluded to, we really don't ever see come to fruition. And as a part two to that, do you think RFK would be a big win to have aligned with Donald if he was to get into the White House?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the second question, all things being equal, it would be helpful to have, if Donald Trump were the next president of the United States, right? If the question is, does having RFK in his ear, is that a positive or a negative from a cannabis perspective? I think that's a positive, right? Some of us, I'm sure we all have differing opinions on RFK. Some people love him, some people don't. But he does express a skepticism of modern Western medicine, and he does indicate a receptiveness to things like cannabis. So I think having him allied with Trump could only be useful. Now, how much of an impact he has on Trump's thinking, I don't really know. But from a cannabis perspective, I think we can see him kind of as an ally. And on the question of whether Trump moderates his position on cannabis, again, I believe, right, that as we get closer and closer to the election, polls will continue to show strong support in Florida for cannabis. And going back to Ohio, that's why I think it's so important to push that message out there to build comfort with people. And look, I would never pretend to be able to predict with any accuracy what Donald Trump is going to do. But I do know that on these two issues, which are abortion rights and cannabis legalization, he has been smart enough to understand that the really rigid positions taken by his right flank are not ones that he can afford, right? If he wants to be successful. So that's not really a prediction, but I do believe it is top of mind for him, and he sees it as a liability. And I will also say the closer that Florida is, and I think, again, regardless of what you think about Kamala Harris, she activates the parts of the Democratic Party that you need in Florida demographically, right? Like the Obama coalition that won in 08 and 012. They're not coming out for Joe Biden, right? They could come out for Kamala Harris. And so if she can make that state close, right, then I think that increases the pressure on him on those two issues to not be on the wrong side of those two issues. So we'll see what happens, but I think the pressure is there for sure.
Yep. And do you think we get a final ruling by the election?
I believe we will get a announcement of a final ruling before the election. Again, as we know, there's 30 days before it's effective, right? That has to be published in the Federal Register. But I believe, for the reasons that Adam mentioned on your podcast earlier, that administrations get their things done before turning them up. And because I know we've been waiting for 2 years, but this process has unfolded according to the operations of government in a very legally and scientifically defensible way. I'm optimistic that before November 5th, 2024, we'll get that decision.
Okay. Hirsh, thank you. Can't thank you enough. This has been great. I think this was quite informative for everybody that was listening. Definitely look forward to doing this again soon. But thank you for your time. It's been real.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
All right, guys. That's going to be it for today. I'm going to wrap it. Like Shad would say, smash that like button, make this thing go viral. And I will see everybody Friday with Kim Rivers at 11 a.m. See you guys soon.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching our latest podcast. Lots of momentum building. You guys getting all excited? Leave comments below. Again, we want to take this viral. Smash that like button and make sure to click on that bell for all notifications as we start to bring on bigger and bigger guests. Don't forget to subscribe to our daily newsletter, the Baked In newsletter, by logging on to thedalesreport.com. And we want to take this viral, as I said, and make this community grow. So make sure to subscribe on that channel because we wouldn't be here without you. Thanks again, everyone, for watching.